And now, coming to you from the classiest radio station on the air, this is...
Welcome to Old Time Radio with a modern twist. Good evening, listeners from the heart of Dodge City, Kansas. This is WWP, your watchful voice on the Southern Plains. Turn up your radio, pull up a chair, and lean close to the cathode ray, or the hearth if you've got one. They say the history of the West was written in blood and gold, but if you look at the map of Kansas, you'll see it was actually etched in iron. Tonight, we begin a two-part series of a journey across the high plains. This is the story of a dream that had no business succeeding. A story of a paper railroad that became a titan. I'm Brad Smalley. This is the Iron Trail to the Queen of the Cowtowns. The year was 1859, and the Kansas Territory lay beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain and the unspoken tension that lingers after violence. Once known as Bleeding Kansas, this frontier had become a crossroads where North and South collided over the fate of slavery, making it a crucible for the nation's most profound conflicts and ambitions. The specter of civil war gathered in the East, a brooding presence on the horizon. But here on the open prairie, men's eyes turned westward, drawn by the silent pull of possibility. Manifest destiny was not merely a phrase. In 1859, it was a fever that burned through the marrow of the nation, a restless, unyielding urge to bind a fractured land with ribbons of iron and hope. Into this charged landscape stepped Cyrus Kurtz Holliday. Now picture Holliday. He wasn't some soft-handed speculator from a New York high-rise. He was a lawyer with the grit of a pioneer and the eyes of a prophet. He'd arrived in '54 with the New England Aid Company, carrying the heavy weight of the Free State cause in his pocket. He didn't just want to build a railroad. He wanted to build a soul for Kansas. In the winter of 1854, Holliday helped shape the city of Topeka, and by 1859, through quiet persistence and political acumen, he had helped secure its designation as the capital. Yet he understood that a capital without vitality was little more than a collection of empty facades. To Holliday, the railroad was the artery through which the future would flow. Where others saw only the fading tracks of the Santa Fe Trail, haunted by memory of wagons and oxen, he glimpsed the outline of something enduring. He envisioned a slender thread of steel binding the Missouri River to the distant adobe walls of Santa Fe, and beyond that, the Pacific, Mexico City, and the farthest reaches of the world. Yet in 1859, such a vision hovered at the edge of delirium, a dream scarcely distinguishable from fantasy. For nearly a decade, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway possessed neither a length of rail nor a single iron spike. It existed solely as words on parchment, a fragile promise sustained by ink and imagination, a paper railroad in every sense. In those days, a paper railroad referred to a company that existed only on paper, with no tracks, trains, or physical assets. Investors and dreamers sketched grand plans, hoping that by securing a charter and raising funds, the company would one day materialize into iron and steam. The risks were immense. Without tangible progress, the venture lived in uncertainty, vulnerable to shifting fortunes and public skepticism. In January of 1860, Holliday sat hunched over a desk in a narrow hotel room in Lawrence, the winter wind rattling the panes as he labored for 2 days to draft a charter. As a member of the Territorial Senate, he understood the machinery of governance, and on February 11th, Governor Metairie set his signature to the act that would give the dream its first legal breath, Thus, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company came into being. Then the world began to unravel. In 1860, a drought turned the Kansas soil to powder. 1861 brought the Civil War, turning the nation's eyes to the battlefields of Virginia and Tennessee. The railroad? It stalled. It gasped for air. In a tiny law office in Atchison, 13 directors sat around a table. They each pledged $4,000 for a total of about $50,000. A principal sum for a farmer, sure, but for a transcontinental railroad, it was a drop of rain in the Mojave Desert. Building such a line would eventually require millions of costs for forged steel, laying track, crossing rivers, and carving tunnels through mountains, far beyond anything the directors could raise on their own. The challenge was almost unimaginable. But Holliday wouldn't let go. Even as the cannons roared back east, he was looking at the horizon. In November of 1863, with the war still undecided, the stockholders voted to change the name. They added 2 words. It was a challenge flung at the impossible. They possessed no wealth, no rails, and a continent ablaze with conflict. Yet they had a name, and in the West, a name could kindle hope where none seemed possible. At times, a name is all you need to start a fire. But a name alone could not shift the earth or set iron upon the prairie. To build an empire, land was required, and securing it would demand more than vision or optimism. Behind every mile of track loomed questions no blueprint could answer. Who truly owned this land, and at what cost would it be claimed? Holliday would soon find himself drawn into the highest stakes political gamesmanship in the capital, navigating a thicket of rival interests, hard bargains, and the murky challenges of displacing settlers and native nations. The choices ahead were fraught with compromise, ambition, and consequence. Decisions destined to leave their mark on local communities, the prairies, and the very soul of Kansas. Our story now turns to the Great Lakes Gamble and the single act of legislation that would transform a fragile dream into an iron reality. The trail, in truth, is only beginning. Well now, Cyrus Holliday had a railroad that existed only on a dusty piece of parchment and a prayer. It's one thing to name a dream, friends. It's quite another to pay for it. In the 1860s, liquid capital in Kansas was about as common as a rainstorm in a dust bowl. The Civil War was bleeding the treasury dry. If Holliday wanted his iron trail, he couldn't look to the banks. He had to head into the one thing the government had in abundance: land. March 3, 1863. President Abraham Lincoln, a man who knew a thing or two about holding a country together, put his pen to a bill sponsored by Kansas Senator Samuel Pomeroy. That signature changed everything. The government's gift was not measured in coin, but in the vast, unbroken stretches of prairie. Alternate sections of land, 10 on each side for every mile of track the Santa Fe advanced. Each mile yielded 6,400 acres, and by the time the rails reached the far edge of Kansas, nearly 3 million acres would lie in the railroad's possession. Yet beneath this apparent generosity lay a formidable condition. From that moment, a decade-long reckoning began. The law demanded that the line stretch unbroken from Atchison to the western border by March 3, 1873. A single day's delay would mean the loss of land, capital, and the fragile hope that had sustained the enterprise. Yet the land itself was a paradox. Vast, untamed, and in the eyes of speculators, nearly worthless. The iron rails had to be laid before the land could be sold, but the land had to be sold to finance the rails. It was a cycle as relentless as the prairie wind, a gamble in which retreat was impossible and the only path led onward. 5 more years passed in a slow, grinding search for capital. Local bonds raised in towns like Shawnee and Osage, each dollar hard won. At last, on October 30th, 1868, the moment arrived. There was no ceremony, no music, no dignitaries in attendance. Only a small gathering of 20 souls on Washington Street in Topeka. Cyrus Holliday, with quiet resolve, took up a shovel and turned the first sod of Kansas earth. The railroad, once confined to paper and promise, had at last broken ground. By the spring of 1869, the locomotive bearing Holliday's name, a 440 American, gleaming and new, pulled its first train from Topeka to Wakarusa. Soon the rails reached Carbondale, 17 miles distant. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe bore the names of distant destinations, yet its first rails ran not from Atchison, but from Topeka, striking southward across the prairie. Why? Because Holliday was as practical as a pair of wool socks. South of Topeka lay Carbondale, and in Carbondale there was coal. The engines needed fuel and the railroad needed freight it could sell today. Atchison, the namesake city, would just have to wait. In the gamble of the frontier, you don't follow the map, you follow the money. The rails pressed onward, the engine stoked with Kansas coal. South and west, the line advanced toward the heart of the frontier's most perilous and profitable enterprise, the great Texas cattle trails. Kansas in the 1870s was a land defined by its scent. A mingling of coal smoke drifting from locomotive stacks, the sweet, bruised aroma of prairie grass trampled underfoot, and the deep, musky presence of longhorn cattle that had wandered north for 1,000 miles. Cyrus Holliday, in his relentless pursuit of progress, had unearthed coal in Carbondale, feeding the hungry engines that carved their way across the prairie. Yet coal was merely the prelude. The true wealth of the plains, the so-called white gold, moved northward on cloven hooves, herds of Texas cattle pressing ever onward. In the years that followed the Civil War, the cities of the East, New York, Chicago, hungered for beef with a fervor that seemed unending, while the open ranges of Texas teemed with untamed cattle. The challenge was elemental. These herds could not be conjured by magic or machine. They would have to make the long journey north, step by weary step. The railroads that could extend its iron rails to the terminus of the Chisholm Trail would cost a fortune. When the Santa Fe reached Emporia in July of 1870, it marked only the beginning. The true contest, and the greater reward, waited further south along the endless grasslands. By 1871, the rails had reached Newton, a modest settlement poised to become a fulcrum of change. Now, Newton wasn't just a stop, it was a dagger aimed at the heart of the competition. Up until then, The Kansas Pacific Railway had a monopoly on the cattle trade in Abilene, but Newton was closer to the Texas border. The Santa Fe built massive stockyards, whispered sweet promises to the trail bosses, and suddenly the Queen of Cowtowns had a rival. By 1872, with the Santa Fe's support of the Wichita and Western Branch Line, the company had moved beyond mere participation. It now commanded the very heart of the enterprise. Yet the drive to expand exacted a heavy toll. By the close of 1869, the company's coffers were nearly empty. Its ambitions mired near Emporia as surely as a wagon trapped in the prairie mud. Survival demanded transformation. The Santa Fe could no longer remain a provincial railroad. It sought salvation in the marble halls of Eastern financiers, turning to the formidable Kidder, Peabody and Company of Boston. Bankers in Boston and across the Atlantic assumed control, offering not only capital but a new order of management. Land offices rose in Topeka, where 3 million acres of federal land were parceled out to those who arrived with little more than a plow and a vision. By the close of 1870, with just 62 miles of track, the Santa Fe had already amassed over $126,000 in gross earnings. The gamble, it seemed, was yielding its reward. Yet while investors tallied their dividends in polished offices, the true labor unfolded in the dust and sweat of the frontier. The Santa Fe was not built by men in tailored suits, but by those who bore the weight of history on their shoulders. Irish immigrants, driven from their homeland by famine, exchanged hunger for the heft of a sledgehammer. Veterans of the Civil War, having laid down their muskets, now took up spikes and hammers, forging a new path across the continent. They made their homes at the ever-shifting end of track, a transient city of canvas and confusion. By hand, they graded the earth, set the massive ties, and drove the iron spikes, their bodies aching with the relentless rhythm of labor. They were not alone. As the years passed, another force emerged along the rails, the truckeros, Mexican laborers seeking refuge from turmoil in their homeland. By the dawn of the 20th century, the railroad's lifeblood flowed through these men as well. The Irish laid the track, the veterans guarded the line and found shelter in makeshift barracks, while the truckeros, charged with the endless task of maintenance, made their homes in converted boxcars that rattled with every passing train. Yet as the iron horse thundered westward, it carried more than commerce. The rails carved through lands that had belonged to Native American nations for generations, threatening to unravel a way of life that predated the first glint of a surveyor's instrument on the horizon. The Iron Trail offered a lifeline to a burgeoning nation, even as it tightened into a noose for those whose homelands it divided. Rails are heading west now toward the Arkansas River. The 1873 deadline is screaming like a tea kettle, and there's a town on the horizon that's about to become the wildest place on earth. Join us next time for Part 2, the Arkansas Valley and the 1873 deadline. This show is sponsored by Life by Aspire. We understand how important it is to protect what matters most to you. As an independent agency, we work with many top-rated life insurance providers to carefully compare options and offer coverage choices that align with your unique needs and financial situation. We're here to help you find peace of mind for your family. For more information, call 620-253-7756 or visit www.lifebyaspire.com. You have been listening to The Iron Trail to the Queen of the Cowtowns, produced by Wild West Podcast. For a transcript of tonight's presentation, go to the program link and click on Transcript. Good night, America, and sleep well.
That whistle blows a lonesome sound across the plain. driving spikes beneath the sun and desert rain. My weary hands know every mile of this steel track. There ain't no point in ever trying to look on back. Just me and my pipe dreaming till the job is done, chasing that horizon headed for the setting sun.